All right, talking Charles Lee here in this second segment of the podcast, but we're going live one more time today. This time we're joined by Jordan. It's Treske, right? Your last name is
Yes.
Treske? Okay, awesome. I should have asked that before we started recording. Whatever. We got Jordan Treske of the Win in Six podcast and Behind the Bucks from Fansided. Jordan, I've asked this to the other guys that joined as well. How are you feeling about your team right now with Giannis hurt and the Hawks absolutely blowing out the Bucks in this last game?
It's we're hanging through right now. I mean, the fact that they're 2 wins away from the conference or NBA finals, just to say. Yeah, I mean, it's been just kind of this postseason of ups and downs, and losing Giannis. Thankfully, there's been no structural damage with his knee or anything like that. Like, that's the good news part about it. But now it's like, how do you soldier on without your best player? So we'll see how that goes tonight. But yeah, still hanging through there.
Right. We're pulling for the Bucks to make it to the finals, play against the Suns. Obviously, former Pelicans on both sides of it. Drew Holiday, So the structural damage, like no structural damage to Giannis, I'm sure that was just a breath of fresh air. You're just like, oh my God, thank the Lord.
Oh, especially just how gruesome it was. Just like you're thinking all these possibilities. It's like, is this? It's not just the end of the season. It's like, how much of a rehab could something like that be if it was serious injury like that? Yeah, don't have to worry about that right now, thankfully. But it's just a matter of, they didn't make anything clear about his return. I wouldn't anticipate him coming back at all this series. If they make it to the finals, I don't even think he's going to come back then. Like, it's not something that you risk, especially when it's someone like Giannis and you just don't want to put him in that position.
Right. And that's fair. And we'll talk a little bit about Coach Bud here, because there are some serious implications going forward for him and if he continues to coach the Bucks. But the reason we're talking here is Charles Lee and the possibility of him becoming the next head coach of the New Orleans Pelicans. So when it comes to Lee, I've asked this same question to the other guys as well. Is this a coach you would endorse to be a head coach later on, because he's just been an assistant in the NBA, hasn't played in the NBA, just played overseas? Is this somebody you would endorse based on what you know of Charles Lee?
I definitely would. I mean, for all the things that we talk about Mike Budenholzer, especially playoff time, he brings clear success to anywhere he goes. Same thing goes for his coaching tree. I mean, you talk about Quinn Snyder, you're talking about Kenny Atkinson. I know that kind of blew up in Brooklyn when Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving got there. But Taylor Jenkins, I think Taylor Jenkins is kind of more of a relevant example in terms of this, where he goes to a team like the Memphis Grizzlies. They draft Ja Morant. They have kind of a Swiss Army knife type player in Jaren Jackson Jr. They have an interesting core and kind of punched above their weight the last 2 years. I think if I'm the Pelicans and kind of looking, the landscape and how this kind of coaching market is, playing out right now, I think a guy like Charles Lee coming from, the Bucks and the Hawks previously, there's success there. There's a model, a blueprint that I think the Pelicans could easily follow with where their roster is at right now in terms of, Zion is Zion, and Brandon Ingram, kind of on that all-star trajectory. May need a little bit more work that way, but certainly there. I think he doesn't have the experience, say, of the other names are kind of associated with the vacancy right now. But I think there's a lot of connections that can be made for Pelicans and Pelicans fans that could kind of be really encouraging in terms of where they need to go.
So you mentioned the fact that we just straight up don't know as much about Lee as we would have Vaughn, or we do now about Willie Green. And, we've talked about under the radar candidates like Kenny Atkinson, like Jamal Mosley, Will Weaver. We even know probably more about Will Weaver than Charles Lee at this point, because Weaver's the head coach overseas and he's been around the organization. So with that said, do you think that advantage is given to those other coaches because of the fact that, maybe it's different for us because we're just on that outside perspective. We're not David Griffin. We're not Trajan Langdon. Is is an advantage given to Green, who's also been under Steve Kerr and Monty Williams, and he's been an NBA player, is an advantage given to him that, at least would you think, that there's an advantage for Green as opposed to Lee because of that?
I see. That's the thing. I mean, they go after like a guy like SVG last year, and obviously, the fact that it's a one and done year for him did not work at all. And I wonder where their searches obviously led them to more kind of maybe taking the next step with a guy that hasn't gotten a coaching job like Lee, like Willie Green, Will Weaver had it in Australia, but NBA coaching job is far different, obviously. I think that kind of reflects in terms of looking at guys that may need that first step into their coaching career could work for a team like the Pelicans that are they're still finding their identity. They're still finding where, what this team wants to be. And I think that kind of plays in the favor of a guy like Lee. Certainly Willie Green, I mean, he's on the Suns coaching staff right now. They're going to the finals, all that stuff. I think it honestly determines or depends on what David Griffin and Trajan Langdon, as you said, like how are they approaching this coaching search rather than what they got 9 months ago, less than that, in terms of picking SVG.
Yeah. Don't remind me.
Sorry.
Okay. Now, the big pull for hiring Lee is his youth and his ability to relate to players. Is that something that you've seen in Milwaukee?
Yes, definitely. I think obviously Giannis and just what he's become even more since Bud and the coaching staff has come to Milwaukee. Chris is a very fine example too. Becomes a 2-time All-Star player. We're seeing this playoffs. I mean, even with inconsistencies, he is still a very capable second option for this Bucks team. And it's not even just the youth because we kind of think of Giannis is 26. He's still reaching his prime. Chris is about 30, smack dab in the middle of his prime. But guys like Brook Lopez or, these guys that just kind of, you didn't really know what their future was a couple of years ago before coming to Milwaukee. And now Brook Lopez is, has been one of the more stable role players that the Bucks have had over the last couple of years and have been, they haven't made it to the finals yet and still will TBD on that front tonight and Saturday at least. But he's been exactly what they needed and has undergone a role transformation that I think it's very encouraging in terms of not just projecting where the Pelicans' youth or their young core can go. If you're going to have guys like Eric Bledsoe, Steven Adams, or I'm forgetting who else, kind of the older players on the Pelicans roster right now, but like if you're wanting the best out of them, I think Lee can kind of tap into that and give them the voice that they need to really, take their games to the next level too.
Sure. And I mean, who knows if Bled and Steven Adams are going to be on the team next year.
Yeah. That's the other thing is like, their roster, it's not that it's in flux, but it's, Lonzo's obviously a free agent, Josh Hart. Like it's just such an interesting way that they can just go in so many directions.
Oh, you're telling me. Yeah. There's so many different ways this offseason can go. They could hold on to either of those guys. Lonzo could be gone. Josh Hart could be gone. I mean, Brandon Ingram could be gone at this rate. Rumors are circulating. We have no idea. The only person I'm willing to give up Brandon Ingram for is probably like a Dame Lillard or maybe.
Yeah, the big package.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And speaking of those two, Zion, Brandon Ingram, Ollie Cosell, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ollie. He's the editor-in-chief of the Bird Rights, put together an article detailing why Lee is his favorite. And he referenced Giannis and Chris Middleton, their ability to work together. And I mean, it's kind of similar. Like Chris Middleton.
Oh, absolutely.
So does it translate? Do you think does that work that he's put in with Middleton and Giannis translate? Can he make that work in New Orleans?
I think definitely. I mean, that's what was interesting to see it from afar last season. And obviously with SVG, like it kind of followed the same trajectory with Giannis early in his career when Jason Kidd was around, that putting the ball in Zion's hands, obviously we saw what the success was there. Now it's just a matter of like, how do you kind of build on that and how does Brandon Ingram play off of that, where his success the year before came with the ball in his hands kind of thing. So I think knowing that Lee saw front and center how that works with guys like Giannis and Chris. I think that's very replicable in New Orleans with Zion and Ingram, and to a lesser extent, like how the other supporting cast can kind of build around that too.
Do you know? Did he have his hands in that, or was that really just Bud? Any of the other coaching staff, Darvin Ham?
I see that that's where it kind of gets a gray area where you just kind of like parse out any little details. I personally do not know if that was who is divvied up what duties and what kind of thing. But obviously they've had this kind of developmental track record dating back to Atlanta where their vitamins, as they call it, like just how everything kind of works and just making players better than what they were before. So yeah, I don't know if he had a direct hand in that, but if he's part of the coaching staff and has a voice and kind of taps into all the players on the roster, you kind of see where the ingredients can come from, if that makes sense.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense. And if anything, he got to observe it, right?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
So then you look at development because a big thing that happened this last year with the addition of Stan Van Gundy to the roster is Jackson Hayes and Nickeil Alexander-Walker getting a lot better. A lot better. Jackson Hayes went from unplayable to this guy could be something. Like he looks like he could be a star in this league. And then now he's playing for Canada, looking great right now. He's looking like a scorer. So where is Lee in terms of the development? Because we don't know if the Pels are going to use that number 10 pick. Maybe get a Corey Kispert, maybe get a Moses Moody, the kid from Australia, Josh Giddey. Who knows? We just don't. We just don't know. And Kyra's still on the roster as of right now. He needs some help to continue to get better. Is Lee in that developmental department? Is that something that he has helped with in terms of like the Dante DiVincenzo's or Pat Connaughton or any of those guys?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like in terms of where the Bucks are at, and kind of the Pelicans are at, an earlier stage where the Bucks are, obviously. But I think the talent that the Pelicans have, and just guys like Lewis, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Jackson Hayes. There's things that you can kind of replicate from how the Bucks have played, where we've seen with Brook and how the drop scheme works for him, and how that's kind of he was an all defensive member last year. That could work really well with a guy like Jackson Hayes. Putting the ball more in the hands of Nickeil Alexander-Walker, can that take that next step? Can Kira Lewis become he was a very buzzy prospect last year. The more reps and more time he gets, I think that could easily work well. And obviously, I know how Pelicans fans felt about Eric Bledsoe this year and how that worked and all that stuff. I think a better or more locked in version of Eric Bledsoe is kind of the Kira Lewis mold that I saw, kind of when he was thought of in where the Bucks were being picked last year for the draft. I don't know. I think that's the thing, is that the Bucks, the development outside of guys like Giannis and Chris and Bledsoe before that, and now it's Drew, like they had pieces there. It was a matter of kind of filling in the guys around them. And I think the Pelicans are at a better position in terms of having better supporting cast around them and kind of take the next step in their game, where the Bucks were kind of getting squeezed as Bud and Lee and Darvin Ham, their whole coaching staff came here a couple of years ago. So it's a little bit of a different trajectory, but you can kind of see some replicable things with the Pelicans prospects.
Sure. And you mentioned Brook Lopez in the drop coverage and how he's sort of filled a role there in Milwaukee. He's also become a three-point shooter at the 5. And Jackson Hayes is starting to do that too. How much do you think there's a correlation there with Lee and helping out in that range, or that specific thing that he does well?
I mean, the spacing was definitely a big part of the Bucks, like how things, kind of became this era of Bud ball and all that stuff. That was a huge thing early on, and kind of opening up lanes, obviously, for Giannis, to a lesser extent, Bledsoe at the time. I mean, we saw with Brook when he first came here, and just kind of they had these things called the blue squares, where they would position him, behind the 3-point line, and just kind of the 5-out system that they needed. And now it's a little bit different. They have like the dunker spot, and just kind of it's much different than how it was a couple years ago. but the overall kind of, spacing elements that I think the Pelicans need to get more structure, I think that will definitely be translatable if Lee, is going to be the guy for them. So I think in terms of, is Jackson Hayes going to be a 3-point shooter like Brook Lopez? I don't know about that. That's a little different, but I think for where the Pelicans need just kind of overall structure, I think Lee can definitely bring that for sure.
Hayes has shown a lot with the 3-point shot. He made 3 in a game. He was 3 for 3 towards the end of the year.
Wow.
Yeah, his free throw touch is great. His touch around the rim is awesome, and he's a freak athlete. So, I'd like to think that Lee can take a little bit of what he got from Lopez and institute with Jackson Hayes. Should Hayes still be on the roster, that's really intriguing. But then also the spacing is that the thought of that is just glorious. I know I've been one to say the Pelicans don't lack spacing, they lack shooting, but I mean, they lack both. Shooting is more the problem as opposed to spacing. But taking that and applying it, what he had in the initial years with Milwaukee, it's going to do a lot for Zion and Brandon Ingram. Brandon Ingram was nowhere near the rim really this year at all in terms of attacking the rim. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing where we're kind of see on the other end of it where shooting that's a harder problem to fix. But spacing, that's something that you can kind of, I mean, we're seeing all around the league. It's not just a Milwaukee thing, but that's something that you can control and just kind of, it works. Everything works out itself as if you have something to build on in terms of a foundation, in terms of a structure and all that stuff. So I think that from a Pelicans perspective, I think that's super encouraging that, the Bucks have made something out of their offense, even when, it comes to the playoff. Like how the Bucks are playing the playoffs right now and how they do it in regular season is very much different than what we've seen. And that's what the Pelicans need. You can't look forward to where the Bucks are right now. They just need something to build on first. Right. Yeah.
And with somebody who's not a jackass.
It's true.
Yeah. So with Lee, the one quote that I've seen that really intrigued me. It was in this ESPN piece from last year. I'm sure you probably know what I'm talking about. I'll read it.
Kevin Arnovitz.
Yep. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, you can find it online. But the quote is, he's touted as a 5-tool coach who is every bit as comfortable having meaningful conversations with a backup point guard as he is dining with a team owner. Those who have worked with him say he has an intuitive sense of how to inspire improvement from players, but also understands high-level strategy and the preparation required to implement it. He is, in the words of one peer, someone who is, quote, categorically going to be an NBA head coach, unquote. So what we get a glimpse of there is his personality, his ability to work with players, and he wasn't an NBA player, like I mentioned, but he is 36. And he played overseas. And in playing overseas, he mentioned that there's not quite that high level of athletic talent, but it's very strategic. Did that, I'm assuming since you saw that quote, did that spark anything in your head in terms of what he could bring to the Pelicans? Or the other thing, before you answer that question, the other thing that I've considered and that a lot of Pelicans media and fans have considered is the hiring of Stan Van Gundy versus Alvin Gentry was a huge overcorrection.
Yes.
The Pelicans needed structure, but they also they loved Alvin Gentry for who he is as a person. Based on that quote or based on what you know in general, can Lee be that? Is he that?
I think that's very much the case. I mean, we haven't really heard any kind of grumblings from the Bucks in terms of, any locker room concerns or anything like that for the last 3 years since Bud came. Obviously, Lee is a part of that. To your point of kind of overcorrecting from Gentry to SVG to wherever this hire is, I think Lee it would be the overcorrection in a good way, where you need some of the things that SVG semi brought to the table, but without the kind of, we saw the things about Ingram and SVG maybe not having the greatest relationship. I don't think that would be a problem with Lee at all. And I think that's the kind of, with the Pelicans and where they are at and kind of talking about, they can go in so many different directions where, whether it's their roster, whether it's this hire, what are they going to do with all those picks that, the Bucks obviously gave them to, that kind of thing where it's not that it's a blank slate, but there's just so many different directions that, and if that's kind of a blessing and a curse in many ways. So I think for where they are right now and what they want to do, I think, like, not to repeat myself, but a guy like Taylor Jenkins, I think that's a very kind of replicable guy that you can look towards and see with Charles Lee that there are pieces there that Lee can kind of tap into and unlock further, and just kind of be the voice that they need for where they are, and kind of just scratching and clawing their way to maybe playoff contention, to being something greater than that.
The Taylor Jenkins comp is really interesting, especially with how much success the Grizzlies had in the play-in and then making the playoffs.
Yeah.
Obviously, Budenholzer came from the Spurs coaching tree, Greg Popovich. So then Taylor Jenkins did as well. So for the conversation about Coach Bud, a big part of the concern is what to be the problem, the rotations and the playoffs. That's the thing that everybody knows, right? And some people come from the perspective of, we can't hire Lee because he's going to be the same thing. What do you say to those people?
I think it's kind of going from A to C without getting, you're overlooking B. You know what I mean? Like, the Pelicans aren't a playoff team right now. And yes, for all the faults that Bud has had historically in the playoffs, and it's been plain to see, he's still a successful NBA head coach. It may not be great, but he's still successful. It's kind of like where Andy Reid was, where it's like his teams have always been good, and it's just a matter of putting it all together when it matters most. The last couple of years, we saw how that went. Last year, especially, just there was a lot of context with the bubble and obviously season shutdown, all that stuff. It just blew up in the Bucks' face. Now it's like, okay, we're back at 2 wins away from being in the finals. They lose their best player, all that stuff. Bud has his faults. I don't necessarily think that's something that you can, put that on. You're not putting that on like Taylor Jenkins, so to speak. You can't really put that on Charles Lee until he gets that position. So until we have some kind of track record, which way he can go, how will he, assign a rotation in the playoffs? What adjustments can he make? All that stuff. Like, you're putting the cart before the horse at that point. You just need something to build on.
Yeah, and that's fair. There's a lot going into being a head coach, not playoff rotations, especially when you're the 11th seed going into the coming year. So that's a very good point. One more question for you regarding Lee. David Griffin is what we call a micromanager. He's got or at least he wants his hands in everything. And that's a big reason why he and Stan Van Gundy did not get along. Lee being 36, myself and I know a few other Pelicans media members said that's the hire, because he'll be able to influence Lee probably more than other coaches. Is Lee someone who's going to be able to manage his boss well, I guess, essentially, is what I'm going for, but able to communicate well and foster a relationship with Griff where they're able to do it maybe together as opposed to being two separate entities?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question. I again, not to repeat myself, I think that's where, unless he gets in that position, we'll see if that works. But, you read a quote like Arnovitz and just kind of the communication, just being that voice in terms of in the locker room, relaying that to, David Griffin, who he's a very successful GM too. Like, I think that's where, from my perspective, million miles away or whatever, that's where the Pelicans need something. They just need that voice that kind of connects everything. They obviously did not have that with SVG, and, who's to say if they had that with Gentry in his last year too. So they're obviously reaching a critical point. And there's all the stuff about Zion and all that stuff that, like, we don't necessarily need to get into, obviously. But if you want a communicator that can kind of bridge the gap between front office, players, all that stuff, I think Lee can definitely bring that, and has the experience working with a guy like Bud that kind of has definitely done that in Atlanta and certainly done that in Milwaukee too.
So prior to us talking tonight, I guess this afternoon, You mentioned that you had done a little bit more extra research on Lee. Is there anything that we didn't address that you've got in front of you that you've seen about him? I know he was a coach at Bucknell, or I think at Bucknell, if I have that correct. And then he was the summer league coach for the Hawks for 1 year. Is there anything else that you found and pertains to his his personality, coaching style, philosophies, anything like that?
No, not that I think we kind of covered it all. I think again, it's one of those things where it's like, with Darvin Ham, I know he's done interviews. I think he was even linked to the Pelicans job last year, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
Yeah. There was something that can kind of, and I think he also had experience as a D-League head coach, a couple more than a decade ago or something like that. Lee, it's a little bit more of kind of like, you're trying to parse for anything kind of thing. But I'm sure I might do a little bit of a deeper dive and see where he's at. But I don't know if there's anything kind of like schematically or anything like that he's spoke out the record about.
Sure. I imagine a lot of his philosophies in terms of offense, defense, being in transition, all that will probably trickle down from Coach Bud and Coach Bob. So, all right, good stuff. Jordan Treske at Jordan Treske on Twitter. You can find all of his work there. Make sure to check out the Win in 6 podcast, especially if the Bucks do win in 6 and head to the NBA. Sure, that'll be fun, and you can check out his work on Fansided as well. Jordan, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thank you.